the gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
Okay, so we are here today with Jeff Merrifield, a former NRC commissioner and also a partner at Pillsbury law firm. I know there are more names associated with that too.
Pillsbury's just fine.
Pillsbury Law Firm's energy practice, specifically their nuclear practice, which is a very old practice, as I've been told.
Yes. Yeah, we actually had, after the advent of the Atomic Energy Act, in the early days of the Atomic Energy Commission, we were the first law firm, and this was under Shaw Pittman, that had a nuclear energy practice. That's over 50 years at this point. So we've been doing this for a long time.
You yourself have also been interested in energy issues since the beginning of your career.
Yeah, it's interesting. I tell a story, and I wish I had the picture here. I was a young Senate staffer. I was working as a legislative assistant on energy issues for then U.S. Senator Gordon Humphrey. And we were in the midst of the licensing activities. Gordon Humphrey was from New Hampshire, which is where I'm from. And Seabrook Station Nuclear Power Plant was in the midst of being licensed. And so one of the issues that was very noteworthy at that time was the appropriateness of what was then the 10-mile emergency planning zone. Seabrook was having a very difficult time being licensed because New Hampshire and Massachusetts bordered each other. A good portion of the emergency evacuation zone was in Massachusetts. And then Governor Michael Dukakis did not want Seabrook to be licensed. And so the state of Massachusetts basically said, we're not going to be involved in emergency planning for Seabrook with the hopes of stopping it. Under President Reagan, there was a discussion of reducing that emergency planning zone to 2 miles, principally because Seabrook has a double containment dome, and they felt technically they could justify it. Well, the senator that I work for, although very supportive of Seabrook, was very much against reducing the emergency evacuation zone because he was concerned about Seabrook Beach and other beaches that would be impacted during the summertime. And so he asked me to get materials to put together to make the argument to President Reagan that this was not a good idea. And ultimately, and of course, this is all pre-internet days. I had to spend a weekend at the Library of Congress going through magazines looking for what I remembered was a picture, ultimately in National Geographic, that showed a picture of Seabrook Station on the beach, and in front of it was this crowd of people, and it really clearly demonstrated, what was going on at the plant. Well, anyway, found this thing, we put it together as a poster, and Senator Humphrey, along with then Congressman Judd Gregg, went on to become a senator, and Congressman Bob Smith, who I also worked for, who went on to become a U.S. senator. They were in the room with President Reagan. And they explained to him what the concern was, and they convinced Reagan that they should not reduce the emergency evacuation zone. Well, I had given Humphrey the photo, and I said, listen, when you go out, you're going to get done meeting with the president, and you're going to be out on the Truman portico. You really need to not show the picture, because the reporters are all going to know what's going on. Well, the bottom line of the story was the photographer from National Geographic had used a fisheye photo lens, so it appeared that Seabrook was looming over the beach, when in fact it was some distance away. So it was, I hate to say deceptive photography, but it was. And of course, needless to say, my boss went out and he showed it, and a whole bunch of questions got answered. But anyway, that was really the start of my involvement on nuclear matters. And then, obviously, over time I became an NRC commissioner, and then it's all gone downhill ever since.
Okay, well, we're not going to fast forward quite that far, quite that quickly.
Right.
Actually, even before we go any further, what made you want to work in Congress or with a senator at a young age? Where did that come from?
Well, the genesis of that was interesting. When you grow up in New Hampshire, as I did, it's very easy to become politically involved. I mean, when you walk around and you talk to a lot of people in New Hampshire, they're highly politically knowledgeable. And the reason for that is New Hampshire has the first in the nation presidential primary. And people in New Hampshire take that really, really seriously. And as a kid, it would be, the town I grew up in, Antrim, New Hampshire, had 2,300 people. It would be very common to meet with most, if not all, of the presidential candidates who would either come to Antrim or a nearby town, Peterborough, where we would see people. And so I sort of caught the bug, and my parents were involved politically. I worked on a presidential campaign when I was young, and then subsequently, decided when I went to Tufts University for college, I wanted to go into political science. Of course, when I came here, I thought I was going to go into defense and foreign policy. And when I went to interview with Senator Humphrey, they said, well, we don't have that available, but we've got energy and environment. I said, okay, well, I'll do that for the time being, but I really want to go into defense and foreign policy. And needless to say, I haven't looked back ever since.
And that set you on the path of your whole career.
Right. And it was there are a few things that have happened during my career that have been happenstance that really sort of set me in a way that I hadn't expected at all. I mean, the trajectory of my life has not gone anywhere the way I thought it would have gone. But that's all positive, by the way.
What was the next major turn that you didn't expect?
Well, I think, I thought when I went to law school, I went to night law school at Georgetown, and so I was able to work in the Senate at the same time I was going to school, and that was a really good thing for me. I do better when I'm busy, and I had decided as a result of the work I had done on the Environment Committee, and I was involved in the 92 Clean Air Act, and I was involved in the Exxon Valdez legislation with all that. So I decided I want to go into environmental law. So the first decision out of law school is, where do I go? Well, I had thought of going back to New Hampshire because at some point in the back of my mind, I thought I might run for political office from New Hampshire. I had the political bug. I've since subsequently been reformed of that. But I thought I would go back to New Hampshire and practice environmental law, but came to realize with a bunch of student debt, I needed to pay off some loans before I got into that. So I started at McKenna & Cuneo, which was a law firm here in D.C.
Also working on environmental issues there.
Working on environmental issues. The first case I ever worked on was the Exxon Valdez case. Because the Exxon had sued, at the time it was Sperry and Unisys, which built the navigational equipment on the ship. And so the first 3 months of working for McKenna, I was at an Exxon litigation office down in Houston, Texas, going through all the documents of the ship. In fact, I personally went through Hazelwood's file and all kinds of stuff from the ship. So it was a fascinating experience. I really enjoyed that. I worked on a variety of other tax cases and other things at McKenna, and my interest in the law at that point had waned. And so when the Republicans retook the Senate in '94, that was when my former boss, Bob Smith, took over as chairman of the Senate subcommittee on Superfund, what was called then Superfund Risk Assessment and Waste Control, or something along those lines. And so I spent 4 years as the Senate expert trying to rewrite the Superfund law.
As an attorney that works for the Senate.
Right, that's right. Yeah, I was working on the Senate Environment Committee, and at that time, and was working to reform that law. It's interesting. I tell a story. So I went to work in an office over in the Hart Building. One of my fellow staffers at that time, who worked for Senator Inhofe, was Andy Wheeler, who is now the head of the EPA. We had two young, sort of fresh-faced folks who were picking up the phones. Right, they were receptionists, staff assistants. One of them was from Rhode Island, the other one was from Colorado. Well, the young man from Colorado went on to become Senator Cory Gardner of Colorado, and the other individual was Sean Spicer.
That is amazing.
So it was quite
So
an adventure.
everyone's been around forever, essentially. Is what you're saying.
Everybody's been around forever, and Ann Klee, who I work with closely as well, she was general counsel. She went on to become the general counsel of the EPA, and we had a few other folks who did very well.
What is a Superfund site, and what were some of the issues that you were looking at there?
Well, the Superfund law, and there's a longer name of which I'm forgetting right away. It was set up as after. Well, there was a site in New York called Love Canal where there was very serious environmental contamination, and the parties responsible for it were not available to pay the cost. And I think at that point in the 70s, we became aware as a country that there were a lot of hazardous waste, sort of abandoned hazardous waste sites out there that needed to be cleaned up. And so Congress passed a law that said we're going to, go back and use a liability scheme to impose the cost of the cleanup on the many people who may have contributed to that site.
Internalizing costs that had formerly been just taken on by the environment and not by the waste contributors themselves.
Right. Now, in theory, and it was under the theory of polluter pays, and in theory that works fine. The problem is you could have a $1 billion waste site, and you might have only contributed a small number of barrels or 100 barrels to that site, but it's strict joint liability. So you could be even for a very small share of
your company's equally on the hook.
You could be on the hook for the whole thing. And so the senator for whom I work, Bob Smith, felt that was inherently unfair, that the orphan share of that ought to get picked up by if a company's gone bankrupt, that share ought to have been picked up by the federal government rather than the party who had a very small share of it. We were thinking more of a proportional liability scheme rather than a joint and several one. Well, long story short, I spent 4 years with several other folks drafting what was about a 280-page bill to reform the Superfund law. We had lots of negotiations. Carol Browner was the head of EPA at that time. She was the administrator. Lots of direct discussions with Carol. She and I really butted heads at that point. We now have a very good personal relationship, in part over nuclear matters. But interesting time. It's also what led me to be an NRC commissioner.
Okay, I want to hear about that too.
So the story there is I had, as part of my duties, I went ahead and investigated a variety of Superfund sites around the country.
And before we get too far ahead, what
Sure.
are the different types of hazardous waste that are out there?
Well, the biggest part of it is chemical waste of a variety of forms. There are also radioactive waste sites out there, but they are generally treated with a different liability, typically treated with a different liability regime, depending upon their source and whatnot. So at that time, the Superfund law was really focused on the cleanup, remediation, and really trying to take those sites back to a point where people could live and work near those sites and not fear for residual environmental contamination. So it was mainly chemical disposal and cleanup. But so as part of the effort to rewrite the Superfund bill, we had a provision in the bill that talked about if you had contamination that went off-site and migrated onto a site where it was clean, under the joint and strict provisions of the law at that time, even though it migrated into someone who was completely innocent, they could potentially be liable because they now had contamination on their property.
Wow.
And there were several of these sites that were out in Arizona. So I went out to Phoenix with Arizona Public Service to take a look at one of these sites. And they made a suggestion at that point, well, since you're out here in Phoenix, why don't you go, come out to Palo Verde Nuclear Station and see Palo Verde. It's the largest nuclear station in the world, in the United States, 3-unit combustion engineering design, great plant. So, never being one to turn down an opportunity to take a tour, I said, sure, I'll go ahead and do it. So we were driving out to the site, and they were pre-briefing me on things like the Institute for Nuclear Power Operations, and that was a very highly rated plant with INPO. What's the NRC process? We were really getting into some areas that I really hadn't worked that much on when I was really concentrating on the Superfund stuff. So,
but you were curious.
Oh, absolutely curious. So we were sitting around the table. We'd taken a tour, done the whole tour, sitting around having lunch, and the question got asked by a guy named Bill Stewart. Bill Stewart was then the chief nuclear officer for Palo Verde, very well-regarded guy, ran it very, very well. And so he asks, well, there are a couple of vacancies on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. You know, what's going to happen with those? Well, one of them was Greta Dykes, who was a Democratic commissioner originally from Arkansas, who was personal friends with the Clintons. She wanted to be renominated, and there was a Republican slot. And at the time, someone had been nominated for that, but they were not. They were, the Clinton White House did not want to move that nomination forward. So there was an effort to try to identify another Republican who could take that slot. And so, discussion around the table, and my friend said, well, gee, could be somebody like Jeff. Jeff could be an NRC commissioner. And it was one of those few light bulb moments I've ever had. And I sort of thought, this is interesting. And so over the course of that weekend, I had a series of discussions. Gee, this might be something I want to throw my name in the hat for.
How do you throw your name in the hat? What is the process by which you express interest in a position like that?
It depends. In my particular case, I spoke to the senator for whom I work, Bob Smith, and the other senator for whom I work, John Chafee, who was the Republican chairman of the Environment Committee at that time. And I got their blessing to seek, trying to get my name put into play. Under the sort of informal Senate rules, when you have a Democratic president, it is the Republican majority leader or Republican leader who basically makes the recommendation to the president as to who those nominees would be. The initial recommendation that Senator Trent Lott, he was majority leader at that point, had made to the president was not acceptable to the Clintons. And so what ensued was a series of discussions with Senator Lott and his staff to basically, put my name in instead. 6 months later, I was on the commission.
Wow. What did you do to get up to speed from the point of just having visited Palo Verde to all of a sudden being at the top of the NRC?
I wasn't a complete neophyte. I mean, I actually had done other things in terms of reviewing nuclear plants and all that. What I didn't fully appreciate when I went to the NRC is the breadth of the regulatory footprint that they have.
Yeah.
I mean, the NRC really regulates cradle to grave pretty much everything civilian-wise when it comes to radioactive and radioactive materials and uranium and all that in the U.S. So, the exception to that is the mining industry, where the NRC's footprint is somewhat limited. So I had to learn about radioisotopes. I had to learn about industrial uses of isotopes. I had to learn more about nuclear units, how to regulate them, how they work. So it was really drinking out of a fire hose the first 6 months. I remember I had lots and lots of briefings, and I would take home piles of reading material every weekend to get up to speed. I had a very good staff. In fact, the legal counsel that I hired, Margie Doan, is now the executive director of the NRC. She also had served as general counsel. So I was fortunate. I had extraordinarily good people who worked for me. But it was interesting because when I first hired my staff, we sat around the table and they said, well, the NRC focuses on a lot of different issues. You really need to sort of think about what are the 2 or 3 issues you're really going to focus on and not worry about the rest of it. And I chafe at that notion. I told them, listen, I'm much more of a buffet style kind of person. There may be a few things that I'm more interested in, but I want to be involved in everything that the NRC does. And so I took a lot of training and I did a lot of travel.
You visited, every plant in the U.S. and most of the countries abroad? You've got to be the most traveled person. I'm the most in all of NRC history.
I'm the most traveled NRC person. So I've been to 30 to 31 countries that then operate nuclear power plants. Every nuclear station in North and South America. Wow. So I've been to everything in Canada. I've been to all 104 nuclear stations in the U.S. I've been to all the So I've traveled a lot. But it wasn't just nuclear power plants. It was also a variety of uranium mines, medical facilities, facilities where they do irradiation, facilities where they were doing production of medical isotopes. I mean, I really got a full and broad range of all of the things that the NRC regulates, and many counterpart facilities internationally. And the reason for that was well, there was a variety of different reasons for that. Number one, it was a great way to learn and become a better regulator. Number two, comparatively, it allowed me to understand where the NRC was vis-a-vis their international counterparts, some good, some bad. And it also, I think, gave me, a much broader ability to advocate, whether it was from a regulatory perspective or subsequently, to really say, I've been there, I've seen these things, I understand them.
Gives you credibility.
It does. Particularly for someone who, as I say, my background was political science. It wasn't hard science.
Do you think that had something to do with it, the fact that your background wasn't as an engineer? In the nuclear field, it's a very engineer-heavy space where a lot of kind of respect comes from being a nuclear engineer. Do you think that's why you put in so much extra work and had to see just everything to kind of show that, hey, you really knew what you were talking about?
I had to work a lot harder than others had to in that position because they had that technical background. I mean, there was certainly, I think, coming into it, people didn't know me at all. I think in terms of from a credibility standpoint, I really had to work to earn my stripes on that. I would say, when he left the NRC, Niels Diaz, who served both as a commissioner and as chairman, gave me something that I will always appreciate. He gave me an honorary Doctorate of Nuclear Engineering award. Now, it was made up. It wasn't a real one that I could take to the bank, but it meant a lot to me.
It meant something.
That he was willing to give me that.
Yeah. Before we move on past the NRC and your time there, I want to just hear maybe about what was one of the most, I don't want to say challenging parts of the jobs. What was something you saw in the industry that was challenging, that through your unique experience of having seen so many places, you kind of formed a kind of a unique perspective on?
I would say probably the hardest thing that we were challenged with when I was there was the issue of nuclear safety culture. If you remember back and I think it was in the 2003 timeframe, there was the incident at Davis-Besse Nuclear Station,
where there was some steam coming out, and that steam formed boric acid deposits, which then ate through the top of the reactor pressure vessel head.
Right, that's right. That was the event, and as a predicate to that, the NRC had a requirement, because we knew that there were some issues and some challenges with steam generator heads. We had put out a requirement that they all need to be inspected in the U.S., and we had a specific timeline to do that. At that time, the First Energy, the utility that owned Davis-Besse, had come to us and said, well, we'd like to wait until our next outage, and we want to, please give us another, I don't know what the number was, 3 months. And they came by with a technical assessment of why that would be valid to do, and they had a series of photos that they showed the agency to demonstrate, this is a photo of the top of the head. We don't think there's an issue there. The technical staff in the NRC, although they weren't united on this, but the senior managers reviewed it. They felt it was appropriate to allow them to go further. The commission bought into that, and we allowed them to move forward. Well, subsequently we found out that, in fact, there had been other photos with lots of boric acid buildup on the top of the reactor that they didn't show us. And there were indications that there were problems. There were things that both the utility missed or obfuscated, and there were things that the NRC staff, the inspection staff, did not pick up on that they really should have. A lot of rust in the filters, for example, in containment. That's a pretty good indicator. You got a material condition issue. Well, we're very clear what happened, right? You ended up with a pineapple-sized hole in the top of this head, and a very it was, it would be categorized as it could have gotten really bad. The inner cladding,
I heard it's only 3/8 of an inch.
It was 3/8 of an inch of cladding that was there, and we don't know for certain how long that would have held out. But had it not held out, that would have been a very serious and consequential issue. Well, The challenge we had as an agency is there are certain things that we impose on licensees. Nuclear safety culture is kind of hard to regulate. And I remember we went up and we testified in front of the House and the Senate on Davis-Besse, including in front of the then chairman of the Senate subcommittee that had jurisdiction on that, who was Senator Voinovich of Ohio. And, you know, he was asking us about safety culture. What should the agency do about safety culture? And the answer that I gave at the time really focused more on, you know, we regulate, as an agency, we regulate safety. We impose safety requirements on utilities, but culture is something which the utility really has to craft and manage. And we really can't impose a culture on them. We can evaluate if they're doing the right things, and we can evaluate their safety conscious work environment. I had this, what I thought was pretty good justification for why we were doing what we were doing or not doing what he wanted us to do. And that was not a very good answer for Senator Voinovich. We got slapped around pretty well on that one. And I think the commission sort of licked its wounds, went back and said, you know, maybe we can do this a little differently. And that began a period of about a year and a half where we rethought how best to do that. We collaborated with the Nuclear Energy Institute, and we collaborated with the Institute for Nuclear Power Operations to sort of figure out, how do we really get to the right place? How do we make sure that as we operate these reactors, the people who are operating them are operating with the highest levels of nuclear safety and have the right safety culture? I think we got to a much better place. It wasn't where we originally thought we were going to go, but that was one where I think the observation of having been to the plants, having seen the people, that helped in making that transition.
And what a transition it's been. I don't go to a single facility, and I travel, to now dozens and soon hundreds of facilities just like you. There's not a facility I don't go to where that I don't have a safety briefing first and
right.
Glasses on, hand on the handrail all the way through.
Well,
across the world, by the way.
No, it is. You know, the funny, I always tell people that the hardest thing about being a safety regulator in that nuclear culture, you know, there's a lot of folks I think who don't fully understand the nuclear industry and really fully appreciate how seriously safety issues are taken. But when you go through all that and you've been a safety regulator, you can't walk past a job site. You can't walk past somebody on a ladder or looking at your environment around you and saying, oh, geez, you know, they ought to do this differently, or gee, that person really ought to get a tie down because they're in an unsafe condition. I mean, once you become so focused on safety issues, it's hard to pull back.
Yeah. One of the things that I find fascinating about your experience is just the true breadth of it. After having worked in the government as a lawyer on environmental issues, as the commissioner at the NRC, you then transition to industry.
Yeah.
I just love that. I love when I see the labs partner with industry on certain projects. And then, of course, you know, pulling the NRC. And it's one of the things that I find so interesting about the nuclear, the whole nuclear, I want to say industry, but it's more. It's like the industry, the labs, the regulators, everyone's kind of working together, sharing experiences. I think it's kind of magical. And you're kind of like an embodiment of that too, because after the NRC, you went into industry.
I did, and you know, it's and that was a very conscious decision. I did that for a couple of reasons. One, I did want to get outside of DC. I wanted to have an opportunity to learn and experience things outside of the Beltway bubble. When I was leaving the NRC, the easy default thing for me to have done is just to become a lobbyist or go work for a law firm. And I had several law firms at the time that were recruiting me to come work for them. And I really felt if I was going to have an opportunity to work in industry and have an opportunity to potentially go in a corporate role, it was really the right time for me to jump. Now, I had a handful of offers at the time of different companies that I could have gone into. I did not initially, when I was hired by the Shaw Group, their power operations based in Charlotte.
They're a construction company.
And they were a engineering and construction company. And at the time, they had a 10% ownership share of Westinghouse and were responsible for building the Summer & Vogel AP1000 units for Westinghouse. And they were also a key part of the group that was going to be building the Sanmen and Haiyang plants in China. And so for those reasons, it was a very attractive thing for me to do because I really wanted to work for a company that was involved in nuclear and in getting new plants built. But I didn't, initially, it's sort of a soft landing. I was working on some, government relations and public affairs and some business development issues. But after about a year, I went straight into business development. And so during the 7 of the 8 years that I worked between the Shaw Group and its successor company, Chicago Bridge and Iron, my role was actually business development. So I wasn't having really much of anything to do with my former role as an NRC commissioner or the government. It was more the interaction I had with utility executives involved with trying to help them or help Shaw work for them either as a maintenance contractor, doing decommissioning, or building new nuclear units.
Business development, that means you're selling their services or their products.
That's right.
And so what were the things that you did to put them ahead of the other competitors in that space?
Well, a lot of course, business development sometimes is a fancy word for sales. Really what you're trying to do, a lot of times it's really opening up the eyes of a company, in this case typically a utility, to understand the breadth of capabilities that Shaw had for assisting them. And so, based on a lot of relationships that I had developed when I was an NRC commissioner, people knew me and people sort of respected what I had to say. And I go meet with people and I say, hey, listen, you've got X, Y, and Z contractors working for you doing maintenance, for example, nuclear maintenance. Here's the things that the Shaw Group can do and the capabilities that they can bring to the table. Let's see if we can find a way to perhaps partner on that. And I did pretty well at that in that particular role. First did a lot assisting our maintenance folks. Shaw was also involved in some environmental contracting and helped with that. And then after probably 6 years, I was actually responsible for all of their power business development. So I had a team.
So not just nuclear.
It wasn't just nuclear. So I had a team of folks who worked for me, both domestically and internationally, working on combined cycle gas units, on nuclear plants, nuclear maintenance, decommissioning, coal. Shaw was a very large builder of coal units and air quality control. So I had the whole span of control.
Something that I've always meant to ask someone in your position who works across different power generation lines. After knowing so much about nuclear and just what makes it so different and so special, both between incredible safety record, incredible
Right.
safety culture, which you helped create,
Right.
just the power of the technology, the fact that it's carbon free, the fact that small land footprint. Was there ever when you're in charge of a business that's selling multiple different power sources, how did it actually feel selling coal but also selling nuclear?
Well, it was okay. I mean, given my druthers, I'd rather sell a nuclear power plant any day. I mean, it's carbon-free generation. It brings tremendous development from a personnel standpoint. The people who have to be trained, the economic impact it has on the communities in which it's placed, and all that. Nuclear, by and far, is what I wanted to do. That was a time period, however, when the price of natural gas was beginning to trend down, and so everyone was building gas units, and so it was part of the group of things that we sold, and so I sort of felt okay about that. Air quality control, I was certainly fine with that. A cleaner coal plant is better than a dirtier coal plant. The hardest part was selling new coal units,
Yeah.
and the one thing I felt better about, at least at the time, was, well, Shaw sold very clean ones. The last unit that Duke built, Cliffside Unit 6, I believe it was called, was at the time when it was initiated, it was an ultra supercritical coal plant. It's the cleanest in the country. I mean, it has a fraction of what some of the plants out in the Midwest were doing at the time. So you sort of felt better that, well, it's a cleaner coal plant. I think the turning point for me, and I'm an individual who wasn't an early adapter of global climate change. It took a while for me to really sort of realize and understand my own personal views on that. But I think the low point for me is we're trying to sell a couple of coal units to a company in the Philippines, and I had to make several very long trips to the Philippines, and I'm sitting there in a very nice hotel room in Manila, thinking, why am I halfway across the world trying to sell coal plants to the Philippines when I really want to get more involved in nuclear? And that was sort of the beginning of a developmental process where I realized I need to get out of that job.
Yeah.
And that led me I came to Pillsbury in 2015, and I've been pretty much 90% of what I do these days is nuclear. I love it. It's where I want to be.
Back in action.
And frankly, to your point on global climate change, one of the clients I'm very honored to work for is ClearPath, which is a clean energy.
You're an advisor to.
I'm an advisor to ClearPath. It's a Republican conservative clean energy foundation focused on driving clean energy choices, and I'm their outside nuclear expert, and really love it. It's a great group of folks to work with.
Yeah, I've interviewed Rich Powell, and
Yep.
they really are smart guys.
They are.
Very smart guys. So you came to Pillsbury. You're working in there. So I guess Pillsbury is a giant law firm. They've got a power practice. Within that, they've got a nuclear energy team, and you're on that team.
Right. So we have our firm has about somewhere between 700 and 800 attorneys, roughly. I should have gotten the exact count. 21 to 22 offices, most in the United States, although we have a presence in the Middle East, London, a lot in Asia, Tokyo. Recently, we added Taipei, and then we've got Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Beijing. So we've got a real good footprint there. What was appealing about Pillsbury is the length of time that Pillsbury has been involved in energy. It's one of our premier areas. The nuclear practice is really considered one of the crown jewels of the firm as a whole. And being involved with a group of folks with such extraordinary experience, both in terms of depth and breadth, has been a real joy. So
what's some of the major transactions that they've been a part of in the nuclear sector?
Well, we've done all kinds of different things. I think one important one for spent fuel issues was the private fuel storage facility. Jay Silberg worked on that years ago. That was really the model, and I was an NRC commissioner at the time. I approved the license for that. It was a model for being able to create an interim storage facility for fuel. Right now, there are several others that are underway. WCS in Texas, Holtec down in New Mexico, both of which are using the licensing process that Pillsbury developed as the model for their facilities as well. Large, M&A transactions. I think the most noteworthy one, obviously, Westinghouse went through the whole bankruptcy proceeding over the last year and a half. We served as outside nuclear counsel for Brookfield, which is a $280 billion private equity firm that was the winning bidder to take over Westinghouse, and we worked with Brookfield to successfully conclude the nuclear elements of that transaction. So that was a very large deal we were happy to be part of as well. Without
getting into anything too proprietary, what were some of the challenges of that transaction? I mean, Westinghouse transaction was something that was heard about around the world. This was one of the major corporate acquisitions that happened because of its significance to nuclear in the U.S. Was there anything specifically that made it difficult or complicated?
I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail on that. I would say, I think overall, the transaction worked quite smoothly, and for good reason. I mean, Brookfield is an extraordinary company, huge.
They have energy experience. They're not just any old asset manager.
No, they do. Brookfield's history actually goes back. They set up one of the first energy companies in Brazil. So the Brookfield family's been involved in energy issues for years. Today, Brookfield, through the Vistra, which is the former Texas Utilities, they're the largest shareholder of that.
They're an operating company.
Vistra recently purchased Dynergy. So Brookfield has the largest share of what is the largest open market energy produced in the United States right now. So
they
Brookfield's
know,
got
yeah.
a big.
So they know energy, they know nuclear.
They do.
This wasn't new math to them.
It wasn't, because remember, Vistra owns Comanche Peak Nuclear Station, so Brookfield was very familiar with all that. No, transaction went very well. No surprises of any real nature. Like any international company that's buying a U.S. business, we had to go through the whole CFIUS process with them. But again, that too worked.
What is that
well.
process?
It's a CFIUS law, and again, I'm going to trip on the acronym, but it's a process where if a foreign corporation buys a majority stake in certain key U.S. businesses, you have to go through a whole review by various departments and agencies of the U.S. government to approve that.
I see, because Westinghouse, although it actually wasn't even formerly U.S. owned, still has like 10,000 employees in the U.S. So it's still
it's a U.S. company. You know, when you go back to the former British Nuclear Fuels Corporation, they purchased Westinghouse, but they had to create a mitigated. They had to mitigate it. So the people who were actually in charge were Americans, but it was held by a foreign corporation. Well, that then went to Toshiba, same thing, and of course now Brookfield, which is based in Toronto, is a Canadian corporation, but they have the appropriate and required mechanisms to make sure that they can own that.
Cool. Something else that you've taken an interest in is the future of nuclear technology as well. You are involved and have developed an expertise around these advanced reactor technologies. Right. Can you tell us, actually, how did you first start thinking about advanced reactor technology?
Well, you know, I'd like to say I came to this one on my own, but I have to give credit where credit is due. It actually is my wife, Diana. I had been so focused on the current fleet, and I had been focused on the AP1000 and the large nuclear units. And she had been sort of watching this for a long time, and this was prior to my coming to Pillsbury. So, you really need to pay attention to this. There's a lot of new designs, non-light water reactor designs are coming out, and you really ought to start to get involved in that. Well, she was right. And when I came to Pillsbury...
How did she spot that trend?
Well, she's smart. Nuclear for us is a family business. Although she's not, although she was a stay-at-home mother, she pays very close attention to the kind of things that I have been involved in over the years, and has been, a real source of research and guidance for me as time has gone on.
That's awesome.
And my kids are all, very well nuclear trained as well.
Any budding engineers?
Well, no. My oldest is finishing up his training. He's actually going to be an apprentice welder starting in a couple of weeks, and his goal is to actually go into nuclear welding.
Yeah.
So he's carrying on the family tradition in a different way. My middle son...
That's actually one of the jobs that I hear is one of the biggest supply chain constraints is actually that specific role, that there aren't enough nuclear welders in the world.
Oh, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. It is a big gap. I would say, if you look as an example, in Canada, where they are refurbishing both the Pickering and Darlington units, one of the things that's going to be a real challenge for them is to have a sufficient number of nuclear-trained welders to do the $20 billion worth of work that is going to happen in Ontario over the next 10 years. So, I could well see my son going up there at some point to be part of the contingent to do that. There will be a lot of U.S. folks who will be drawn into that work, as it is probably the largest nuclear construction project underway right now, aside from the Vogtle site. But you asked about getting back to advanced reactors.
Advanced reactors, yeah.
So I had come back here and connected with David Blee, who's an old friend of mine who runs
the U.S. Nuclear Infrastructure Council.
Well,
or they changed the name.
U.S. Nuclear Industry Council.
Industry Council. Okay.
And David, we talked about advanced reactors, and we both saw that there were a variety of them coming about. I had been brought on board by Terrestrial Energy, which is a developer of a very good molten salt reactor design. And so David and I came up with the notion that we ought to sort of energize around an advanced nuclear reactor task force. And so there are probably 15 to 20 members of that group within the context of NIC, And I just became more and more involved with NRC, with other nuclear industry folks in town in supporting that particular element of the industry. I also brought on board, they brought me on board X Energy. I'm an outside advisor to X Energy on their
who produces the TRISO Pebble fuel.
That's right.
Technology.
They have two things. Part of the company is developing a high temperature gas Pebble-Bed reactor that uses the TRISO fuel. The other part of it is they are developing an actual fuel fabrication facility. Currently, that's the test part of that, or the initial production, will be in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, right, at the Oak Ridge site. And they will be producing fuel not only for their own needs, but for several other companies as well.
Very smart business model.
Yeah, it is. But I've sort of watched this evolve, and over the course of the last 3.5 years I've been working on this. I think a lot of movement. A lot of companies were identified. Third Way, which is a Democratic
think tank,
sort of centrist Democratic think tank, identified that there could be 50 to 60 developers of advanced reactor technologies out there right there. Some portion of them, probably 1/5 of those are fusion reactor developers. And I think those numbers are probably right, but they range quite a bit. Some of them are sort of very sophisticated, very well-funded entities. Others are really, really startups. Some of them are not too far from the conceptual phase. Sometimes I say, two folks and a PowerPoint, and not much more. But where we've seen this industry go over the course of the last 3.5 years is really started to take off.
There's a lot of excitement around bringing new nuclear technologies into the mix.
Yeah. Well, I think that's driven by the fact it's reflective of a couple of things. Number one is change in the market. So in order to be successful, you have to have reactor designs that can compete better with the combined cycle natural gas, number one. Number two, with the advent of a larger amount of distributed power, having a gigawatt-sized nuclear power plant just doesn't make a whole lot of sense anymore. Right. So having something that can fit in, whether it's 10 megawatts, 40 megawatts, 150 megawatts, makes a lot more sense in a lot of applications. And the final one is, it's generated a lot of interest on countries that are not currently nuclear power producers. So there's a handful of countries in Africa, for example, would not be in a position to build a gigawatt-size, 1,000 megawatt plant, but they may be interested in building a plant that's 150 megawatts or has 150 megawatts equivalent.
So to paraphrase, the economics of the competition has changed. The structure of the grid itself has changed, and then international markets have changed. And all of this is the opportunity for advanced reactor companies to develop a product that fits better given each of those three changes.
Yeah, but there's a final one that I need to mention that's critically important. It's not just about power. For the longest time, it was the nuclear power effort. This is not about power. This is about producing high-grade industrial heat. That high-grade industrial heat may be used for power production, or it may be used for desalination. It may be used for chemical processes of one form or another. So it's really taking and harnessing the atom in a different way that opens up a lot more opportunities.
And these are some of the advantages that a few of your clients like Terrestrial and X Energy tout, this high temperature heat.
Yes, exactly. And there are many others that do it as well, but that's exactly right. And so the first users of the technology may decide they want to use it for desalination purposes.
Which has a different competition profile out there in the market. If you are going to compete in terms of producing electricity, it looks different than if you're going to compete producing heat. And this is something where nuclear has an advantage.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. And the other thing that I think is important about some of these designs is when you have a very large nuclear power plant, you're generating lots and lots of waste heat. So typically you've got to either have a seaside opportunity, or you've got to have an inland river or lake in order to be able to produce, basically provide a heat sink for the excess heat. Well, given their size and their design, some of these advanced reactors, non-light water reactors, are being developed not needing access to those large water sources.
I see. So what you're saying is there were siting restrictions for the gigawatts, for the former gigawatt scale plants, based on their water consumption.
Yes, that was one of the key considerations you had to have. If you had a large gigawatt size light water plant, you had to have ready access to some form of water in order to make it work. With many of these designs, if you combine those with an air cooling style system, you could put them in locations where there's very, very little water.
Which opens up not only new markets domestically, but new markets internationally as well.
Yes.
Do you focus on international work at all? Do you have a good sense of what's going on internationally?
I would say we do. I mean, about half the work that Pillsbury does is in the international market. I think probably what we were most known for is the work that we did on behalf of the United Arab Emirates in developing the Baccarat plants. We assisted and did some review on the initial statutory framework for the UAE. We helped put together the regulatory authority. We put together the operating authority. We ran the bid solicitation, and we put together what we believe is one of the finest EPC contracts ever for a nuclear power plant.
I'm going to have you break out EPC for the audience.
Engineering, procurement, and construction. I'm glad you did that. I usually chastise people for using acronyms, so I try to avoid getting into that. So we used all the lessons learned we've known for almost 50 years in putting that contract together. And I think what is noteworthy is the fact that there have been no significant, in fact, no change orders to that contract that we're aware of. I think we anticipated all the things that were going to happen.
And the UAE plants have come online now?
Well,
or they're coming?
They're coming. It's somewhat an odd circumstance. There are other nuclear units that have been delayed as a result of construction or design or things of that nature. The units in the UAE are somewhat unique in that these plant designs, and they really date back to a U.S. design that was adapted by the Koreans.
The combustion
engineering.
Yeah.
The plants have the construction has gone very, very well. It's a good, solid, robust design. The first unit is up and pretty much ready to operate. The challenge has been getting the skilled workforce trained and necessary to actually be able to operate it. So I think that site is somewhat unique, and it is more of a human resource issue than it is a construction issue.
Seems like a great opportunity for our operators here almost to be able to export our management and workforce model to other countries.
Yeah, no, and that's certainly something I know, and I'm aware of several utilities that are either are or want to be involved in helping out there and other reactor programs around the world. So that was really a very noteworthy one for us. We also were very involved initially and are again in assisting Saudi Arabia in the development of its nuclear program. And the final one I would have to mention that's noteworthy is we are also involved in the Akuyu development in Turkey. So we're assisting in that program coming together as well.
Does Turkey have a nuclear plant now?
They have 4 nuclear units under construction by Atomstroy-Export, which is the Russian designer of those plants.
And where do you see some of the international interest as we move forward? I know China's building a lot. Are there other considerations from the Asian countries in terms of either building or financing or constructing nuclear around the world?
Yeah, well, I think, and I always tell people you got to look at this in a greater context. If you follow some of the news stories, you'd be led to believe that nuclear power is on this inexorable decline, and that's really a false narrative. If you look at the information that's provided by the World Nuclear Association, there's probably 60 nuclear power plants, roughly, that are actively under construction today. Now, the biggest number of those clearly are in China. They have a very active program. It is their desire by the mid-2030s to have as many nuclear stations as the U.S., which is currently the world leader. India has a very active program underway that provides potential opportunities for U.S. companies to go there and build some plants. There are other countries in Asia that are looking at nuclear units, and I think we'll see more announcements as time goes on. Bangladesh currently has a couple of units under construction by Russia, so that's a new entrant that's coming onto the field. I think when you look at the market as a whole, today China is a very strong competitor. They have an indigenous, they have a design that really has its roots Westinghouse Framatome, and then was adapted by the Chinese, called Hualong 1. That's in the market right now.
This is a pressurized water
This
reactor.
is a light water reactor, pressurized water reactor. They have a derivation of the Westinghouse AP1000 pressurized water reactor design that they have come up with, called the Chinese Advanced Passive Reactor 1400, CAP 1400. They're marketing.
So it's a larger version of the newest Westinghouse style reactor, the
Yes,
AP1000.
and they are marketing that internationally. Koreans are still out there with their design, which is a derivation of the combustion engineering
The
design.
System 80 or something.
System 80 plus.
System 80 plus.
French, obviously, Framatome is continuing to sell the EPR. Westinghouse and to a lesser extent GE, are still actively involved internationally in trying to sell their units. So it's a mix. I mean, 50 years ago, if you want to buy a nuclear power plant, either you bought it from the U.S. or you bought it from Russia. That market has changed. It's a much more diverse market these days.
So now that there are several countries, each with their own developer, some have a couple developers, like we've got Westinghouse and GE.
Yep.
China, I think, has 2 developers as well.
Yep.
So now that you see this kind of robust, competitive marketplace to buy nuclear power plants, how does that change things? How do these companies have to think in order to be competitive? Does this create opportunity then for these advanced tech, for the newest developers to come in, because now everyone's trying to think, hey, we've got to build different things to differentiate ourselves?
Well, I think it means several things on several levels. The first one is, like I mentioned, 50 years ago, if you want to buy a nuclear power plant, you went to GE, you went to Westinghouse, or you went to the Russians. To a lesser extent, you went to the Canadians at one point. And then the market expanded. A lot more people were out selling nuclear power plants. But for the most part, those were large reactors. Those were 1,000-plus megawatt plants. And I think, when you look at the field right now, number one, there's a lot greater diversity of opportunities for countries that want to buy nuclear units. So competition is greater. Some of those competitors are state-owned institutions or state-owned enterprises and have the full financing backup of their government. This is the case with China. It's the case with Russia, to a somewhat lesser extent with Korea, and certainly the French have been very supportive of what Areva, now Framatome, is trying to do. So that makes it really tough for a Westinghouse or GE, which doesn't have that same level of government funding and whatnot. So that's one area. Second one is, it's no longer a one-size-fits-all. I think what we've seen with the development of advanced nuclear reactors, the non-light water reactors, is you're really feeling a much more diverse need for nuclear. You're not just telling people, well, if you want to buy a nuclear power plant, you got to buy 1,000 megawatt. Here, there may be some countries for whom 1,000 megawatt reactors make sense. China, India, large countries that have large power demands. There are some developing countries. There are some countries which have more unique needs for the high temperature aspects of advanced nuclear that basically increase the pool of people who may wish to buy them. So I do believe that over the course of the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to see a growth in the number of countries that actually want to go ahead and build and operate nuclear power plants, but those may be countries that buy a 40 megawatt plant or a 120 megawatt plant, or they may buy several that add up to less than 1,000 megawatts. That's, I think, some of what we're going to see from a developmental standpoint, and where I think there's some real opportunities for advanced reactor developers.
You've seen just so much from your experience politically, your experience at the NRC, your experience in industry, and how your experience here at a law firm helping out the startups and some of the bigger companies as well. Given this breadth of insight, as we wrap up here, can you just kind of give us maybe some free legal advice to some of the up-and-coming companies out there who want to get into this game, who want to take it from that concept stage to full-blown reactor design, who maybe even have 30 or 40 people, 10 million in funding, and want to take it to the next level. What is your advice for what they should be looking at, or how they should be thinking about growth in the nuclear sector in order to be on the best foot forward?
Well, I think there's sort of three closing comments I would make there. One, as far as advanced reactor developers are concerned, I mean, it's a long game. It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. You really need to be thinking of it in terms of how do you get the financing, how do you get through the regulatory structure, how do you get the appropriate and necessary government support, and how do you develop the design in the right timing and with the right partners, engineering and construction and design firms as well, to put you on the path to success. And you really got to be really thinking about it in the long term, and you can't just get enamored with your technology. You really need to think about this as a program. The second thing I would say is, and I say this as someone who has worked both in and out of the law, there is, engineers generally are suspicious or don't like lawyers. And lawyers can actually provide a useful service in identifying, some of the roadblocks that may be out there and help assist in that strategy. And this is a lot of what I do, really helping companies strategize, how do I move this down the road? How do I go about getting that financing? How do I go about getting the regulatory approval for some changes that I need that are going to be critical to my design moving forward? So all that plays into it, and I think good lawyers, whether it's me, Pillsbury, or someone else, are important to get some advice there. The third thing I'd say as a final comment is, one of the hindrances that this industry has had is it doesn't communicate very well. A lot of folks go to engineering school because they don't want to get up and they don't want to write papers, and they don't want to get up and talk to a lot of people. And I saw a real lesson of this during the Fukushima event. So in the very initial stages of that event and the reporting coverage of it, they brought in some folks who were, former university professors. They brought in some folks who were in the industry, who had sort of worked in the industry, and many of those folks, frankly, aren't very good communicators. The nuclear industry does not do a particularly good job of communicating, from my standpoint. At my wife's suggestion, I volunteered and talked to the CEO of my company and said, I'd like to go up to DC and volunteer to try to help out with some of that communication. Really set the facts straight and explain to people what's going on. And I think one of the benefits I had, because I wasn't an engineer and because I had I'd been to these plants, I'd regulated these plants, I understood it, and I also was able to capture it in a much more plain English way. I spent about 2.5 weeks. I did about 100 interviews, 38 of them on live TV, really trying to explain to people, what was going on, what wasn't going on, why should people be concerned, why shouldn't people be concerned? And I think that was an area where I really felt like I brought something to the table, in an area that I think typically is not well served. Having someone like me who was actually non-technical but could look at those technical issues in a way that was, and could explain them in a way that was understandable to a typical individual in the news media who typically aren't technical, and to an average member of the public who's worried. And I think I hopefully did a service in that regard.
Jeff Merrifield, always a pleasure.
Thank you.